Hello and welcome to the first of 5 video lectures about the human value of tolerance. It is called Rule of Law and explores the question, how does society become tolerant? The template for social order has 3 components. Firstly, authority. How is the bossing about that large-scale cooperation requires, how is that bossing about done? Secondly, what is sacred? What brings coherence to a large-scale society? And third, loyalty. How do the inhabitants of a society, characterized by large-scale cooperation, know who's in and who's out? Let's look at the first part of that template, authority, and contrast the 2 different versions of social order. First, social order version 1. Authority in agricultural civilizations, coerced cooperation. There's an absolute ruler and a ruthless gene-determined aristocracy. They are the leaders of a formalized tribe. They use the surplus that agricultural societies regularly produce for whatever pleases the ruler. Could be armies, pyramids, studying the stars, whatever floats his boat. They have a warrior ethos. Physical might is right. They're ready to defend their powerful selves from within and without. An invader from outside, an insurrection from within, both threaten the privileges of the elite, so must be dealt with ruthlessly. There's little tolerance. Sometimes the powerful might be merciful, showing some restraint, showing some of their humanity. But that's not something you could depend on, not a rule of any kind, just the whims of the powerful. Then came social order version 2, the authority we know in advanced industrial societies, rational cooperation. There's institutions administering the rule of law and a competence-determined meritocracy. That's a real change here. It's no longer just who your parents are and hence who you know. What you know now counts. And having rules with institutions that administer those rules means that absent corruption, it's society's interests that matter more than the interests of the powerful. There's a managerial ethos. This conscious reasoning is right, trying to do what is best for their society. And this managerial ethos prevails in all walks of society. So a manager in a company is trying to meet their company's goals. A nurse in a hospital is trying to do what's best for the patients on their ward. A bureaucrat in a government department is trying to implement the elected government's policy. Tolerance develops in the West, mutual restraint. And as we'll see, tolerance develops, this mutual restraint among all members of society, enforced by the rule of law, in contrast with relying on the selective restraint of the powerful in version 1. Tolerance, let's remind ourselves, is the freedom of conscience, freedom of enterprise, freedom of choice, as step by step we disinherit ourselves from the limitations of the tribalism of our ancestors. Progress is the hard business of social development. Tolerance is the softer spread of mutual restraint, which in time becomes equality before the law. From the powerful occasionally showing mercy to equality before the law. How? How did that happen? When we talk about the development of the rule of law in the West, it usually starts with Magna Carta. There are a few intermediate steps, such as the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution, and then, hey presto, we have the rule of law. We're going to try and fill in some of the gaps here. Technically, I suppose, we should start with Moses and God's 10 Commandments, But let's follow convention and start with Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was a document signed by King John of England after negotiations with his barons and their French and Scots allies at Runnymede near London in England in 1215. It was a Charter of Liberties, a document constituting a fundamental guarantee of rights and privileges, mainly for the aristocracy, which King John duly abandoned at the first opportunity. It's easy to understand why people, especially American lawyers who have a plaque commemorating commemorating the event at the site of the signing of Magna Carta, it's understandable that they would focus on the paperwork involved in the development of the rule of law. But deeper than that are the ideas behind the human value of tolerance, which leads to the need for written rules. The first step on the road to tolerance comes at the end of 130 years of religious wars in Europe. As legend has it, the root cause of the wars was the nailing by Martin Luther of his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church on October 31st, 1517. Thus, Protestantism was born as a challenge to the power of the Catholic Church and Europe's Catholic princes. The death, suffering, and devastation involved in more than a century of war is hard to comprehend. So it was a relief when one clear winner emerged. Not the Catholics or the Protestants, but tolerance. Other than the usual shuffling of territory and power that war brings, the main outcome was the beginning of the acceptance of freedom of conscience, because neither side could secure an outright victory. Freedom of conscience, freedom of belief. You leave my beliefs alone and I'll leave yours alone. And, it has to be said, not arrived at by moral imperative, but as a way to end war. Freedom of belief was not something that was completely new. The Ottoman Empire did tolerate faiths other than Islam at that time, but it was new to Europe. And only in Europe at that time, which was what constituted the West at that time, did it lead further. The scientific revolution and the progress that followed contributed to a reduction in tribalism by making it easier for people to interact with each other. There was a freedom of choice, the freedom of movement that trains with steam engines bring by reducing physical segregation. Perhaps the first social impact of fossil fuels. The next step was the Enlightenment in Europe and the idea of three key freedoms. The second freedom of conscience, the freedom of speech. You have the right to say what you feel or think, as do I. Not exactly new. The Vikings were famous for their parliaments. But after the suppression of Galileo in the 17th century, it is important to recognize the move towards the acceptance of free speech. And there's freedom of enterprise with private property. You leave my stuff alone, I'll leave yours alone. Magna Carta, we could think, was a limited version of this for King John's barons. But the idea of private property is fundamental to the rule of law. The second freedom of enterprise, free markets. My labour, intellect and property are mine to trade. Even hunter-gatherers traded. But as it turns out, free markets are in most cases the most efficient way to allocate resources. They generate price signals which drive the behavior of customers and suppliers that produces an equilibrium between demand and supply, at least in theory. But this feature of microeconomics is not the fundamental argument for free markets. The fundamental argument is a moral one. I should be free to sell the product of my labour and my intellect and my stuff as I deem fit. and so should you. This is made more important with industrialization and the labor and intellectual specialization that comes with it. Then something happened in the West in the second half of the 20th century that we might describe as a change in values, or better, the full adoption of human values. The results were the completion of the move to votes for women and all others previously disenfranchised, decolonization in Europe and desegregation in the US, the decriminalization of homosexuality paving the way for marriage equality, and the passing of anti-discrimination laws to enforce equality throughout society, which consolidates equality before the law. You live the way you choose, so will I do. The second freedom of choice, equality before the law. Taken together, we can see that tolerance comes from the mutual recognition that all people are the same in being individually conscious with free will and minds of their own. Reason, not the mighty dictating how things should be. Reason leading to freedom of conscience, freedom of enterprise, and freedom of choice. That is tolerance. These steps can be seen as mutual restraint advancing across society. Instead of the most powerful in society restraining people from exercising their free will, society is facilitating mutual restraint through the rule of law. Mutual restraint is what reasonable people do. The rule of law comes from our conscious reasoning. Reason is right. To summarize, rule of law means freedom of belief. However righteous you feel you are, you cannot force your beliefs onto me. Of movement, we will even break nature's restraints. Of speech, however much of a bully you are, you will not silence me. Of private property, however weak you think I am, you cannot take what is mine. Of free markets, however much you might want to, you cannot monopolize the fruits of my work. With rights, you cannot dictate how I should live my life. Free will means I have the, for want of a better word, the right to decide how to live my life, while of course taking responsibility for my own choices and living under the rule of law, which takes into account everyone else's rights, not just mine. Through conscious reasoning, by becoming tolerant, the West moved from physical might is right to conscious reason is right. So who writes the rules of law? In the West, there's more to it than just law. There's the whole package we call democracy. Fukuyama says in his book, The Origins of Power, that democracy was not invented, it developed over time. There are three parts to democracy, says Fukuyama. Firstly, a central state, the nation or the nation state, which has a flag, constitution, borders which are defended. It's a focus for our loyalty. Whichever political party is running it, we expect our government to organize our defense, administer state functions, and keep the peace so that we feel safe going about our daily lives. And a peaceful state, upholding law and order, is, or at least it should be, a magnet for our loyalty. It lets us live our lives as we will and choose, free from the whims of the powerful. Secondly, there's the rule of law, which is codified mutual restraint, as we discussed on the previous slide, a source of societal authority, and it's transparent for all to see. Transparency is important. Ever since Moses gave us those first 10 rules to regulate society on tablets that could be read, we in the West have appreciated knowing what is and is not prohibited. Thirdly, accountable government. Institutions devoted to the social development of society as a whole, which means progress, economic growth. Society as a whole, not the special interests of powerful individuals or groups. Plus a meritocracy. The rule of law needs to be administered and enforced independently of political power to ensure equality before the law. That's called the separation of powers. Power to write the laws, the government, should be determined by the people through free and fair elections. Hence, the government is accountable. The electorate selects representatives to legislate the choices and trade-offs society requires within a constitutional separation of powers. But let's not forget that complex industrial societies still require specialists, managers, and experts arranged in a hierarchy of competence. We call that a competence-based meritocracy. These ideas, these three ideas, as described by Fukuyama, developed into democratically regulated capitalism, or social order version 2, rational cooperation. What are the advantages of democracy, of the kind of society that we live in today, the advanced industrial society, the societies of the West? What are its advantages? Well, democracy's USP is that the trust and cooperation that tolerance and mutual restraint, the rule of law, bring, and that is better for progress than blind loyalty to and direction from some master. Salespeople use the concept of something called something's unique selling proposition, or USP. Anyone who has lived and worked in totalitarian, authoritarian, and democratic countries, or studied them, can tell you what democracy's USP is. Freely chosen, rational cooperation is better for progress, that's increasing knowledge, wealth, and health, where there is the freedom that tolerance, mutual restraint, and the rule of law. And as a bonus, the rational cooperation of democracy simply gives a better lived experience than any other kind of cooperation. Being a citizen, employee, consumer is better than being at the bottom of a rung of a caste system, being a serf tied to the land, or certainly a slave in chains. Version 2, social order, beats version 1, social order. And there's a third, less tangible advantage to democracy. The more effective we are at overcoming our tribal instincts and broadening the network, the greater will be our access to the distributed intelligence that is a human population. Because we are individually conscious, intelligence is distributed across society. The fewer social barriers, the more mutual restraint and tolerance, the better our collective intelligence operates. Democracy is predicated on that third, less tangible advantage of collective intelligence. Democracy is built on the idea that the collective intelligence of a population is wiser than a ruling individual, a ruling party, or a ruling dogma. This wisdom of crowds means valuing the diversity of minds that democracy brings. Democracy must operate alongside the fact that there are some people better placed than others to do certain things. In the day-to-day life of a complex, advanced industrial society, we need competent, determined, and experienced managers, experts, and specialists. They run things day to day. The hierarchy that they form, formal and informal, we call a meritocracy. Tolerance means mutual restraint, the reducing of social segregation and tribalism. Democracy means experiencing and valuing real human diversity and competence. So, are we there yet? Are Western societies tolerant? Here are just 3 of the thoughts that come to mind when contemplating that question. There's more tolerance still to come. So many feel that there's still some way to go. For example, marijuana is being legalized ad hoc in one jurisdiction, then another across the West. There's also tolerance of what ought to be intolerable. For example, the Chinese Communist Party runs concentration camps for a Muslim minority and denies Tibetan self-determination. The West does some token protests, but mainly opts for a geopolitical quiet life. And most reasonable people would say that tolerance has its limits. We're not going to tolerate murder, paedophilia, theft, not parking in the designated area. Western society is unlikely to tolerate any of these anytime soon. And there's a complication. As well as questions, there's a complication. Increasing tolerance has been about reducing society-enforced social segregation. For example, rigid gender roles, apartheid, the Jim Crow, US South or European colonies, criminalizing homosexuality. These things, it should be noted, often administered and enforced through laws. When we talk about increasing tolerance by reducing social segregation, the idea of disinheriting ourselves from the tribalism of our ancestors, we mean the removal of barriers and segregation that is enforced by society. And we must take care when talking about the rule of law that we always mean equality before the law. Merely documenting the way the powerful can push the weak around, let's call it documented might is right, is not rule of law. Only when there is equality before the law of all individual citizens, regardless of gender, race, creed, sexuality, or any other group identity, only then can we say that there is the rule of law. But social segregation remains. There's individually chosen social segregation. Civic identities such as family, community, employer, profession, faith group, sports team. The peaceful and fruitful existence of these identity groups actually is a sign of tolerance. There is a sequence here. We started as hunter-gatherers where we were scattered around, and you could really think of that as natural segregation. We naturally were scattered in our small bands. Then agricultural civilizations formed, and there was coerced cooperation, enforced social segregation into various roles and functions within those civilizations. And now we live in advanced industrial societies where we have chosen segregation. People choose civic identities, and that is segregation, but chosen segregation. So maybe tolerance is all about getting to chosen. Maybe those of us who adopt the human value of tolerance must now focus on stopping any slippage back to the intolerance of yesterday, the time when social segregation by group was enforced by the powerful on the weaker. Progress may or may not be limitless, but tolerance? Some environmentalists assert that progress is not limitless. Typical of that thinking is a book from the 1970s by a group called the Club of Rome, the book called The Limits to Growth. It's a famous example of that thinking. Others proclaim that there are no known limits to human ingenuity and hence to growth and progress. Steven Pinker is a notable proponent of that idea and his book Enlightenment Now is a notable example of that genre. But what about tolerance? Does that have limits? Tolerance means equality for all before the law. Were the anti-discrimination laws of the late 20th century the last step? Not so much discussion and debate about that. Instead of trying to answer the question in the abstract, the next 4 video lectures will look at 4 different aspects of Western society today. Those 4 different aspects are gender, ethnicity, race, inequality, and politics. Thank you for watching. The next in the series, Understanding Ourselves Through Our Human Values, is the second of 5 video lectures about the human value of tolerance. It is called Gender and explores the question, what about social segregation by gender? It can be found at www.conservatus.com, where there's reasoning that resonates. Conservatus. Keep safe, intact, safe from danger, our human values.